but we've got a minute to go. Great. And Emma Kate at the back, just text me if there's any issues and I'll have my phone on, but on silent.
Will do. I'm letting everybody in now.
Excellent. So we are getting 100 people moving into the room as we speak. So welcome to everyone who has arrived on this very, very special Zoom event. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes as everyone enters the room. I've got lots of faces in front of me, which is very exciting. So welcome to Avid Reader. And just for the people who have just entered the room, we have a small house party of close associates in the actual physical room. So we have 10 people in the room who are close friends, and we're also zooming out to all of you. So this will feel a little bit like old school in real life events, I hope. So welcome to this experimental, exciting Zoom, little bit in real life event. Hopefully this is going to move us a little bit more towards the time when we can all freely associate at Avid Reader and pack a bunch of people into the room, which we all hope will be very, very soon. So cross fingers about that. So I think without further ado, I think it might be time to start. So I'm just going to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. In this area, it's the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to any other elders who are here tonight. And also I'd like to acknowledge that because we're in the Zoom universe, we are able to zoom out to the lands of many other Aboriginal peoples around Australia. And I'd like to pay my deepest respects to all their elders, past, present and emerging, and also to acknowledge that this is Aboriginal land, it always was, always will be, and that sovereignty was never ceded. Now tonight at this very special, partially very small in real life group event, the house party we'll call it. We're not going to be able to take questions, unfortunately, because the setup doesn't allow us to kind of have the questions come in as we would normally do on a Zoom event. But if you do want to email events@avidreader.com.au with any comments or anything that you want me to pass on to Christine tonight, I'm very happy to do that. Or if you do want to put them in the chat function, Emma Kate, who is managing the room, will be able to do that for us. So tonight for you guys out in the Zoom universe, there's actually a 10% discount for online purchases. So if you want to gather together a cart of books, including, of course, the book of the moment, but also anything else that you want to put in your cart. If you use the word event, E-V-E-N-T, at the checkout, you'll be able to get a 10% discount. So that's very exciting. And that's really all I need to tell you. You can use the chat function to talk to Emma Kate if you do want to at any time, but I am going to pass you on to the wonderful Paul Barclay, who is a Walkley Award-winning journalist. He's been a literary judge and a producer of many, many programs on many different platforms, including Big Ideas on Radio National. And that is what he is recording for tonight. So without further ado, I'm passing you on to Paul, and welcome to Paul Barclay.
Thank you very much to all of you in this intimate setting. It's terrific to be here. Thanks a lot to Avid Reader, to Fiona and Chrissy for allowing us to come into the store and have an in-store event once again. It's really lovely to be here, even though it is rather socially distanced out there in the audience, but it does feel very familiar, and I always love having conversations among the books. It just feels like the right place to talk about these sorts of things. And what a pleasure to be at an actual in-person book launch. Man, they're rare events these days. People around you to celebrate all of the work that went into putting the book together. Turning Down the Noise, which is the book we are here to launch, Christine's book, is in part the story of her quest to slow down, seek silence and calm, and ultimately lead a better life. But really, it's a universal story. Who hasn't felt that the world is getting ever faster, noisier, busier, more digitally demanding, more stressful. Christine was feeling all of that, wanted to reclaim some simplicity, some clarity, some silence in her life. As part of that journey, she attended a 10-day silence retreat and has survived to tell the tale. Perhaps she even enjoyed it. We'll find that out in a moment. But the book's not just a memoir. She's dug deep. She's done a pile of research on the benefits of silence and also the health effects of too much noise. I'm sure you know all this. Christine is an award-winning journalist, a communications consultant. I think we're all aware of the publications that she has written for. Please welcome her to Avid Reader. I feel like we've been at so many events together over so many years, and I can't believe it's the first time you and I have got to sit down and have a conversation like this. So
we've been in so many green rooms together. I was looking forward to the green room experience.
Yeah, well, small mercies. We have an in-store experience. When did you first realise that you needed more silence in your life? Was there a moment, or was it just modern life that worn you down?
I think there was a series of moments that are about how loud my life was. You can't seek silence until you realise the flip side, how noisy your life is. And I had a series of moments that were all ironically related to success. In this world, it seems that the more successful your life is, the busier you are. The busier you are, the more switched on you are, the more noise in your life. And I give to you as a measure of that the two-phone phenomenon. When did it become a measure of success that you have two phones?
I've not reached that level of success yet, I have to say.
Is that an ABC thing? Is that, don't tell the government about that. They'll be down on it like a ton of bricks. So I had achieved the big job, the big executive job, a corporate communications job in Sydney. We had the standard stereotypical successful life. We had the house in the leafy harbourside suburb. I was working just off Martin Place. I had an office with some sort of window and a view. I had a wonderful partner who was also successful in his job in media. So there you are. And I had two phones. And I say that with some humour, but it is actually a sign that somehow you're so important that people have to talk to you all the time.
So is that one phone for work and one phone for family and friends kind of thing?
In theory, yes, but very quickly, as I say in the book, very quickly everybody learns both numbers. And so if one doesn't get answered, the second phone will ring, and both phones will ring at the same time. And actually, that says it all, doesn't it? Because is the phone call from your child, or partner, or father, in my case, very importantly, because he became ill, is that more important than the phone call from the CEO or a minister or a colleague saying that there's a crisis at work? So there is this measure as you climb the ladder of success, meaning that you have to constantly be on. So the noise begins right there.
Yeah.
I tell a story of just how ridiculous it had become when possibly because I was balancing two phones all the time. During the 2016 election, I was helping run a campaign on behalf of the organisation I worked for, feeding into that campaign. And I developed a really poor, sort of almost frozen shoulder, probably from nursing a phone under it all the time and carrying lots of mobile devices. And my EA, because another thing I had, because I was so very important, was an EA, she booked me into a very early morning physio session, and 7 a.m. start. And I walked in there, and of course my phone was pinging with news alerts, with texts, with social media updates. So I walked in, but juggling all of those things. And I got on the table, and he was going to dry needle me, which, if you don't know what that is, it's a form of acupuncture used by physios where they needle into the muscle to release it. And I lay down for him to dry needle my neck, and my phone rang with the CEO and my boss on it at sort of 7:45 wanting to discuss what was in the news. I said, that's fine, just keep going. And I lay down, and for the 45 minutes of that appointment, I continued the conversation with her while needles were being stuck into my neck. And I got up, he said, wow, I've seen some busy people, but I've never had anybody do that.
Yeah.
So that's how noisy my life was at that point.
Yeah, the 2 phone thing sounds just actually totally horrible, to be honest. But of course, there was also that moment, wasn't there, when your dad got sick? And reading that story, I've not gone down the road of meditating or seeking silence, but I've been in the position that you were in of getting that phone call and being a journalist with deadlines and a busy life where my dad got sick. A phone call, I think it was on a Sunday, and he had a heart attack, was touch and go, had to fly down to see him. And but it took me several days to kind of gel that. I think I was reading the book for an interview that I was meant to be doing later that week while I was on the plane going to Melbourne to see my dad, who was in intensive care. And it was really when I went into intensive care and spoke to my family that I thought, what am I thinking about reading a book for an event? But it is a kind of example of how the way you live your life, just you kind of internalize this way of living, and it takes something to shake you out of that way of thinking, doesn't it?
It really does. It's such a tight juggle, isn't it? And there's almost a sort of a cognitive dissonance that sets in where someone makes a demand or something makes a demand on you that doesn't fit your to-do list. And your brain keeps saying, but we can keep doing this. And that's exactly what I went into when my father he'd had a stroke, and then he fell and broke. They thought it was his hip, but it was actually a bad break of his thigh bone. And coincidentally, I was flying up that day to organise a meeting between Pauline Hanson and my boss for negotiations over some policy or other. And I got what both phones started going. People were trying to contact me. And what I remember of that day is going into I've got this mode. I can manage both things. I can manage the meeting. I can manage my father, who had to be moved out of one hospital because they didn't have a surgeon available to do the surgery, moved to another hospital. And I just immediately thought, there's a way out of this. It's just going to involve lots of phone calls, because that's where my head was. But even at that time, I remember looking back, sort of at the beginning of this journey, there were just little flashes from that day, sitting in the ambulance with him, being at a hospital with him when we moved, where he was moved, he was settled, he was waiting for surgery. And I thought, well, okay, I can get to the lunch with Hanson in time, that's fine. And there was a part of me, the heart part of me was, but I just want to stay here. But even then the brain was saying, but you can't stay here, you've got things to do and the phones are going. So that was the beginning of something's not right here.
That's what's going on in your life. But when you talk about your need to turn down the noise of modern living that you're referring to is not just the literal noise, the fact that there's a lot of loudness out there, a lot of people shouting at you, and politics is loud, everything is louder. But it's also about the fact that phones are constantly ringing and pinging and buzzing. Social media demands are constantly on you. The digital devices constantly need to be attended to. There's movement, overstimulus. Give us an idea of what you're referring to when you use this term noise, and the noise that you wanted to turn down.
It's a great question, because for a long time that really obsessed me. I for a while thought, is this oral noise? I just kept thinking I need the noise turned down. So for a while I got so obsessed with oral noise, I actually had a decibel meter in my phone where I could measure what's going on. And so there is the noise of the public world, as you were saying very ably, the pings and dings of mobile devices, the digital noise, the email arriving noise, the text, the social media alerts. There is the noise of around us of living in a modern world where we actually probably have become, we don't notice it, but it is very definitely there. We notice it when we're away from it in the country. Suddenly the natural world is there and it's quiet. That was for human beings, for most of the time we were on the planet, the normal state. Our brains still think at some level that is the normal state. Our brains don't like constant noise even when we're sleeping. So there's that sort of noise. But I quickly realized that, and the noise of offices and constant meetings and things like that, the noise of media that I've been involved in that is becoming more heightened, more angry, more polarized. The noise of the political cycle that I had to deal with as part of my job. But I quickly realized that simply being in quiet places didn't make me feel like the volume had been turned down.
Yeah.
And here's the humbling thing. This is not a new phenomenon. Take it back to ancient Rome. You know, Rome at its height, about to be at its downfall, the downfall was about to begin, sort of 4 centuries AD. And, you know, there's wine, there's women, there's song. If you're rich, it's great. If you're poor, it's not so great. But there's pretty much anything going for anybody if you had the money. And a group of people, a group of Christians decided, that's it, we're out. The desert, that they became known as the desert fathers and mothers. They fled to the desert because they thought this is debauched and noisy and we need to be somewhere where, I assume, they felt that they could commune better with God. Very quickly, they began writing about and speaking about the fact that you must can't quiet your mind. They're in the middle of the desert, living in caves. And very quickly they recognise that that's only part of the problem. The noise in your head will follow you. And similarly, I realised, I began thinking about that in my own life, that I could be in a temple, in a church, in a cave, in a forest. But for example, if I had a phone that was on silent, but I was scrolling it, I wasn't going to feel like I was very quiet. That's it. That's, you know, an example. The flip side of that is there are monks in very densely populated countries like India, you know, Cambodia, Thailand, who are capable of meditating in the middle of very densely populated cities. So I realized then there is something about the noise in our heads. Yes, it helps to be in a quiet place, but that's only part of the journey.
So were you after techniques that were going to make it easier for you to navigate life in the modern world, quieten things down, be calmer? Or were you after something more than that? Were you after enlightenment? Were you after something more spiritual?
Well, I wouldn't have said no to enlightenment if I'd fallen over it along the way. Being a journalist and thinking very suspiciously about anything hokey or woo-woo, I decided that if I needed to research this. So the first thing I wanted to do is research, is noise in all of its forms? What does the science say about this? Is it okay? Can we adapt to it? All of those things. Is digital noise, is it getting worse for us with all of the noise that we're putting into our heads with digital devices? What does the science say about that? And conversely, what does the science say about quiet practices in places? If it's so bad, if noise is bad, can we counteract some of it? Because I also recognized I wasn't going to be running away to become a Buddhist nun. I did think about it, that's not a lie. I was in peak hour traffic with 2 small children in car seats at one point as a single mother, and I was devastated to realize that actually my vocation was to become a Buddhist nun. But no, I realized seriously that that's not going to happen for most of us. We are going to have to continue to engage with a busy world. So I wanted to find out whether quiet practices and places could help.
Yeah. If I can quote you, in a world where being busy is considered a virtue, where our value is calculated by how productive we are, how can we justify simply being still? In an era when we are pushed to express our opinions loudly and often and to showcase our identities for perusal in an online shopfront, where's the reward in simply watching our thoughts and reactions around us without inserting commentary or curation? It's a great quote, and I think some people are better at this than others. But do you think that there's this fear of irrelevance if we are silent, that if you are silent in our business especially, that you will effectively disappear, that no one will have any use for you anymore? So you've constantly got to be making your presence felt, and that means not being silent.
Oh, very much so. And more so, I think in the last 10 to 12 years, I mean, 2007, the first iPhone was put on the market, I think, 2007. From that moment on, we were carrying around this sort of photo albums, and the urge to curate our lives was amplified. So yeah, absolutely, it's much more difficult. Oddly, as you read that, I thought, people have asked me lately, but you're a journalist. How can you want to turn down the noise? How can you want to be quiet? And so only very recently, after I wrote the book, I realized, and I touch on it in the book, being a journalist, I wanted to listen. I wanted to learn about other people and other things and ask questions and listen. And what's changed isn't, I think that is still a valid job description for journalists. The media's changed. I would argue that it's not journalism that's being done anymore. When you're yelling your own opinions, constantly, 24/7, that's not actually questioning, listening, thinking. I mean, I look at you, Paul, and I think what you do so well is actually listen to what people are saying and ask questions of them. That requires a comfort with your own silence.
It also requires talking, though, in order to elicit that from other people. And you would know that as well. In order, a story comes from an interview, a conversation, ringing someone up. And, there are times, I'm sure you've felt this, where you're sick of the sound of your own voice, almost. Did you feel that? And was that part of the quest for silence?
I went on very early on. I wouldn't call it. It wasn't a silent retreat. It was a health retreat. I won't name it because we're the ABC. But I just felt that I didn't want to speak. I didn't want to speak, and I didn't want to have to engage in conversations. I wanted to be, because I was so overstimulated. So I asked them. I noticed that often after people do massages and things like that at this particular health retreat, they would be given a sticker that they could wear saying, "Shh, I'm whatever, recovering," or just shut up. And I said to them when I rang up, "I'll come, but I just want to not talk the whole time." And they said, "We have a sticker for that."
Yeah, of course they do.
But interestingly, very first lesson, you very quickly, at first it was great. Okay, I don't have to account for myself. I can just be, but very quickly you have that relevancy thing. Who am I? Who am I if I'm not saying, "Hi, I'm Christine, I'm a journalist, and I think this, and that," at the dinner table with other people? Or, "Hey, you really need to try this hot stone massage with chiming bells." Very quickly you confront something that is very uncomfortable, which is that I'm actually, who am I when I'm not telling everybody who I am?
You're confronting your own ego, really, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
You're putting your own ego on the shelf. Is that something that you realised you needed to do if you wanted to progress in this journey that you'd taken?
Very much so, because if you go back to my dad or your dad, or somebody who is going through the process of dying, eventually there's no space for words. There's lots of words that you want to say, but there's actually a need to just be present. And we've lost that ability, or we're losing it very quickly. And so, yeah, and you need to rid your ego. When I was watching Dad in hospital, it was my ego trying to control the situation by saying, "I can just ring the next specialist. I can just do this and just do that." When actually, ultimately, and I had a great relationship with my dad. He had explained what he wanted. He had probably, although he'd hate this because he wasn't religious, but it was a very Buddhist approach to death. To confront the reality of it. And ultimately it was me who had to learn to shut up and stop trying to control it. This was happening and I had to need to be present. Now that's a big lesson, but every day we confront that. There's stuff that we can't control. Australia, the world is going through that in a way right now. There's a whole heap of stuff we can't control. So what we've got is lots of, I think, conversation wars and cultural warriors who decide to interpret it through the lens of which government's doing it better. That's not going to control anything, but it fills the space and lets them feel relevant.
But part of being a successful, ambitious professional in the modern world is the belief, and you've probably been told this or had this ingrained in you from a young age, that you can control your life, or large slabs of it. In a sense, this is in part about letting go and basically saying, well, no, there are all of these things outside of my control. I imagine that's quite a hard thing to recognise.
It's a really tricky thing. I think particularly in Western advanced capitalist cultures, we think we are productive. Our only value is in being, what we're doing at work. Particularly those of us who are fortunate enough to work in, I guess, what you call intellectual capital. Your value is what you're putting out there on your screen and on your, and we don't value. You look at the society we have. We don't value old people, children, people with disabilities, because they're not producing anything. They're not out there putting something outside themselves.
Maybe COVID's a wake-up call in that respect, perhaps.
Very much so.
The great thing about the book is it takes you on many journeys, many trips to Tasmania, to India, to the United States. You travel all over the place. One of the trips is on a 10-day silent retreat with your partner, Peter, who's here tonight. In fact, I think it might have been Peter who suggested to you this would be a good idea, this 10-day retreat. Give us an idea of what is involved in a 10-day silence retreat. 10 days is a long time without talking. How hard was it? What were you hoping that you might get out of it?
First, let me say, it's not something that you do if you've never done a silent retreat before. They'll probably screen you out.
You work your way up.
You
to
work
10
your way
days,
up.
do you?
Absolutely. So by the time you're lining up for a 10-day Vipassana retreat that you have an idea that it's going to be hard, and some of the reasons it's going to be hard. What was I hoping to get out of it? I think it was curiosity. I'd known people who said it changed their life, who said it was really, really difficult. But to be honest, Paul, I wanted to know, what am I going to meet there? Because I knew it was going to be me. That was all there would be.
Yeah.
I'll make the observation that came back to me a couple of times while I was in this retreat in Tasmania, outside of Hobart. We live in the era of the selfie. We live in a self-obsessed era. And yet, what's the thing we're most scared of?
Yeah.
Everybody, so many people who talked to me about this book have said the 10-day retreat. Oh my God, that must have been the worst.
Yes, you told your book club about this and they were horrified at the prospect.
We were talking about another book, the Leanne Moriarty book, 9 Perfect Strangers, in which they go to a health retreat where awful things happen to these people. They get drugged with LSD. They get locked away in the basement and told the house is on fire and they're all going to die. But the thing that most people thought was the worst was that they had to be silent.
Mm.
And at that time when we were doing that book, I thought, do I admit now that I've signed up for a 10-day silent retreat, not just a 10-day silent retreat, but it's actually over the Christmas New Year break.
And just on that other point, we'll come back to the 10-day retreat, but you quote this piece of research, scientific experiment, that basically people would rather be subject to electric shocks than spend 15 minutes with themselves with no external stimulus.
Can I go on a short tangent with that one? Because I love it. So Harvard University of Virginia piece of research, they gave volunteers an electric shock, so they knew that it was going to be painful. Everybody agreed, that's really painful. I would pay for that to not happen ever again. Thank you very much. Then they get put into an empty room by themselves. And of the, I think it's 18 men and 24 women that they did this with, I think 2/3 of the men and 1/4 of the women subjected themselves to that electric shock just because it was the only thing they could do in that room. The question that I immediately raised was, why so few women compared to the men? And of course the penny dropped. These are women, these are mothers who are like, an empty room? No one's going to come and watch me pee. Yeah. Nobody's going to ask me, what are we having for dinner? I'm going to stay here.
Deal with that.
Yeah. But yes, it raises the quote, the Blaise Pascal quote, most men's miseries come from their inability to sit in an empty room with their own thoughts.
Yeah.
Because people will do anything to avoid it. And you find that very quickly at a meditation retreat.
So that's right. So in a sense, you realise that you're going to meet yourself. That's all there is going to be over these 10 days. Did that prospect frighten you at all, or not?
I had a sense that it was going to be difficult. I didn't know how it was going to be difficult, which is actually good because it's difficult in different ways. You bring your own baggage, right? And even if you don't know what that baggage is, it's going to come up in some way. And for some people, it's actually not. I mean, we had, for ours, there was one person left after the first 24 hours. And that's not unusual. We had one woman who cried, sobbed for 3 days at least. Like, you know, and it was, you know, there's the coffers, and I don't know what it is about men, but the clearing of the sinuses, guys, really, why? But yeah, I don't think, I didn't really know what it was, and that should be okay. That's the one thing that I realized is that, again, in this world, we won't embark on things unless we know what's at the other side a lot of the time. It'd be good if we were prepared to go, you know what, I'm just going to give this, I'm going to run, and I'm not going to say I'm going to run a marathon. I'm just going to see what happens if I run. You
did say, though, that it was one of the hardest things that you've done. What was so hard about it?
Okay, so your brain will do a lot of things to stop you being alone or being bored. It will. It's the old thing about, and I'm sure, Paul, you've had it, anyone who's done a university assignment has had it, that suddenly cleaning the fridge or, you know, folding the washing or any number of other really
almost
boring
anything else.
Yes.
Yeah.
Taking the dog for another walk. It more interesting than facing that empty page. And that is your brain saying, I don't want to do this. This is hard. Same thing, you get there and your brain will do lots of things. You will, I fell asleep a lot at first. And you just have to, and not only do you have to accept that and just keep coming back to being awake, but not trying to control it. That's in itself really difficult. It's very difficult not to get irritated with yourself. This is where the stories start coming in. I'm a failure. I'm an idiot. What am I doing here? This is a waste of time. That's all the noise in your head. There are, for me, interestingly, one of the things I quickly realized I do, maybe it's being a journalist, is start telling myself stories about describing, how would I describe the teacher? How would I describe Peter right now? Is Peter being really good at this and I'm not being really good at this?
Because he's doing it at the same time as you're doing it, but you have no contact with one another.
The Passionate retreats, just to give you a sense of them, you are not allowed to bring books, which killed me. You're not allowed to bring writing materials. I cheated a bit, took a few notes. You're not allowed to do any other forms of exercise other than walking, because they recognize that people escape through running, through yoga, through whatever other things they do. You're not allowed to make eye contact, because eye contact is a very, very powerful form of communication. They do everything. And yes, there are men, but you are screened off from the men. You see them in the meditation hall, but that's about all. If you are very, very naughty, you might deliberately on about day 7 meet the eyes of your partner just to see if he's going to ignore you or whether he's going to look at you. He looked at me and he looked again. So you do all sorts of things. You quickly realize, it's amazing that stripped of everything, I started to read, when I found myself reading the side of the toothpaste box. Like, who knew that was so interesting? But the flip side is, the more you strip away, the more your senses unfurl. That's the amazing, and that's part of the wonder of doing it, is you go outside into the sunshine, you sit on the grass, and that's enough.
So you're not just being silent, you're meditating, aren't you, as well? You
spend pretty much most of your day meditating. You can get up at 4 a.m. and meditate in the hall, or you can meditate in your room. Some places you don't have your own room. If you're really hardcore, you're in a dorm. It's almost all meditation. there a break, during the day that you can walk, but that's about all.
That's a lot of meditation, isn't it?
I got to tell you though, Paul, I'm a chronic insomniac, and I have never slept as well. That in itself said, there is good stuff happening here.
Yeah.
I would go to bed and deep sleep.
Yeah.
Of the type that I can't remember experiencing in any other place.
Yeah, and this is the point at which we really need to say that there are some people who might think that this sounds rather woolly, but in fact, this is the form of meditation that has been subjected to the most scientific research of any forms of meditation, and the benefits are fairly well established scientifically, I understand.
Yeah, and rigorously. I mean, it's worth noting that the Dalai Lama really pushed a lot of this scientific research. He didn't shy away from, hey, this is our thing and it's really secret. He actually engaged with a few neuroscientists in the US, said, I want you to look into what's going on. And why aren't you researching what creates happiness and well-being rather than just the negatives? He set up, and this is documented in the book, he made it possible for them to scan the brains and the brain activity of what they call the Olympic monks, the monks that have been meditating for 30,000 hours, 60,000 hours, those sorts of monks, who had never been outside of Tibet. They took them in. And this is the other thing that's really important. It was very important to me because, again, I wanted to see the evidence. The evidence has only started to really be accumulated in the last 10 to 20 years when we started to have things like fMRIs.
This is when you put the things on your brain and you can measure the neural activity, basically.
And you can, with different techniques, find what part of the brain, what circuits are lighting up there. Yeah. And, the first time, I love the story of Mingyur Rinpoche, who is one of those Olympic monks who flew to Wisconsin to meet a fellow called Richie Davis, who has worked very closely with him doing this research. And they put the things on his head. And the idea was you're going to meditate, do a compassion meditation for 3 minutes and a minute downtime and then another compassion meditation. And they were actually worried he's not going to get into that state fast enough. They're not going to see the changes. And remember, this is the first time in the world it's ever been done. And they said, okay, start. And there was this massive explosion of light on the screen, so big that they actually thought that he's knocked a chord, which is what I would have done, knocked over the computer or something. It was just him going immediately.
Because he's an Olympic meditator.
Exactly.
Yeah, the best there is.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the important thing to bear in mind, though, is that, very few people are going to attain that.
That's right. Which is my next question. So that's fantastic. But for the average lay meditator who's seeking to integrate this into daily life, to deal with the kind of things we've already spoken about, making life more peaceful and manageable, reducing the noise, what does the medical and scientific research say about that? I understand my doctor has actually told me that there's pretty good evidence around lowering blood pressure through effective meditation. That's one thing that seems to be scientifically established. Yeah,
lowering blood pressure. Firstly, I'll say a disclaimer. Hell of a lot of dodgy science out there. There's some scientists in the room as we speak, I'm aware. There's lots of dodgy science out there. But the stuff that's been, Richie Davidson again, has led the push for peer-reviewed science, really what they call gold standard. And I document that in the book, how they...
double-blind randomized trials.
Really. And partly because, again, the idea is we want to know what works, what doesn't, what's good, what's bad. There's no point pretending something works when it doesn't. And what they've found is even, 14 minutes of, it depends on the type of meditation, will start to, as you said, increase focus, reduce what's called the attentional blink, where you start losing focus. Obviously blood pressure, immune benefits. Elizabeth Blackburn, who recently won a Nobel Prize, Australian, for looking into the telomere effects. Well, we won't go into the science of telomeres, but things that are believed to slow down aging. She's now a meditator because there's enough science there to say that, come on, reducing the blood pressure, lighting up certain parts of your neural activity that encourage compassion, depending on the type of meditation you do. I go back to focus. I go back to those sorts of things. But also, things like reducing pain. That one blew me away. Zen meditators who knew that they were going to have their hand held over a steel plate that was going to be gradually heated up, could hold their hand there, 2 degrees higher temperature, with less sense of elevated, the things that are telling you you're getting stressed, elevated pulse rate, those sorts of things. For me, I can attest to that. I came back, I am a chronic chair dancer when I'm at the dentist. Hate the dentist, really don't like the dentist at all. Always somebody who has to have gas. I came out of Vipassana and went there and thought, I'm just going to meditate through this. And if somebody had said that to me before I'd done Vipassana, I'd be like, yeah, right, good, thanks very much for gas. Gas now, lots of it. All I can say is I breathed through it. I observed, because they teach you to observe the sensations at a minute level, and you can stay with them. So, there is still science being accumulated, lots of it in the book. But what I would say to people is, if somebody said to you that you can do something for free, you can do something that you don't have to buy the latest gear, lycra, to do it. You don't have to sign up and go somewhere, 35 degrees and do it for, an hour in different postures. You don't have to, there are generally speaking, no side effects unless you have existing there are some things around if you're a depressive and anxious person. Very limited side effects. You can do it anywhere and it's going to make you feel better. How long will it make you feel better? Well, that depends on how consistently and how long you do it for. Things will get better as you do more of it more consistently. Why wouldn't you do it?
Yeah.
If it was a pill, you'd take it.
We could talk about meditation all night. There are other things that you pursue in your quest for silence, and one is kind of communing with nature, I suppose is one way to put it. A few years ago, I spent some time talking to David George Haskell at the Byron Writers Festival. He's a guy who wrote a fascinating book that I originally thought was complete quackery, which was essentially about trees talking, making sounds, making songs, as the title of his book alluded to. But after reading his book and speaking with him, I was just transfixed by the idea. Now, I say all of that because you came into contact with a guy called George Hempton.
Gordon Hempton.
Sorry, it was Gordon Hempton,
Yes.
was it? An acoustic ecologist who similarly is about the sounds of nature and finding the world's quiet places, of which apparently he's compiled a list. Give us a bit more about Hempton and what he's on about, because that was very interesting.
He's known in our house as St. Gordon of the Silence.
Okay.
I'll never forget when I heard him. He was on a podcast being interviewed by Krista Tippett. I heard him on the street in Neutral Bay in Sydney, and I stopped dead. Angry Sydney joggers, because they're usually angry, pushing past me. What are you doing? Keep moving. He speaks a bit like David Haskell. They sound mythological, don't they?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, it's true.
I say find the men who listen to trees and listen to them, and women. There are women out there who do it as well. He is an acoustic ecologist who has spent his career, and in lucrative ways, recording soundscapes, which are used in movies, which are used in games, things like that. His big thing, though, is finding silence, because it's multi-layered. And back in 2012, he said there were 12 remaining silent places in the continental US. What his definition of silence was somewhere where he could record 15 minutes or more of sound, none of which was man-made. Only 12, probably fewer now. He keeps a few of them secret, won't tell. I'm like, the first I read this book and I was like, tell me the places,
Give me the list. Yeah.
Oh yeah, tell me, I want to go to the places. One of them he has shared. He lives in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State. And there's a place in the Hoh River Valley, which is part of Olympic National Park. Why is it so quiet? It's because it's got the highest level of rainfall in the US. So that keeps the tourists away. it also, you know, it keeps activity down, even animal activity, and it's full of those trees, those monster trees. Anybody who's seen What It's Worth, don't know what your demographic is, Paul, but the Twilight series, it's set up there. Forks, I went through Forks, which is where the vampires started turning up. Those trees that are enormous.
So you're so taken by his work that you go to the Hoh River Valley in Washington.
I think I talked about it so often that firstly, Peter might have thought there was a thing happening with Gordon, but secondly, finally decided he broke and sent me to Olympic, go find this quiet place. I was obsessed with it. I just thought this must be magical.
Yeah,
right?
and was it?
It is like a fairy tale. Particularly, I realised for Australians, and I'll come back to that because it's an important point, to be in this world of ginormous trees, like trees that as I describe it, you have to sort of bend yourself into a P. You bend so far back, you've got to lean back and put your hands on your hips to sort of hold yourself up to look up to see the top of them. But what that does as well is it blocks the sun. So you don't have a lot of what we have here, a lot of that sort of scrub stuff, that mid-level stuff. You have thick moss because it stays wet down there. It stays snowy down there, big drifts of snow. And, you know, moss so thick that you actually can lie on it, like in a fairy tale. And trees so large that, you know, they create their own weather systems. Trees that you can be sheltered in, as I did, you know. And he gave me the directions to find. I should go back. He declared 1 square inch of silence in the middle of the river, the Hoh River. It was a bit of a political act to draw attention to the fact that silence is an endangered quality.
Yep.
And you can walk there. He has made the directions clear, and it's not an impossible walk, but you know, very few people do it. It's not like there's not a coffee or anything else on the way to, you know, coffee booth or food or stuff to Instagram. It's just a walk through this forest with a lovely, lovely river. Very few animals. I kept thinking maybe I'll get eaten by bears because I don't know. I just thought there's stuff that can eat me in the US. But no, and very quiet. No insect noise. You realise how much insect noise and bird noise you get in Australia. And I walked there, and again, very quickly, and I hadn't done the 10-day retreat, I realized your brain will just go to places, and I thought that's okay. Mainly I was spent a lot of time thinking, why is a country like this got a president like that?
Yeah.
A president who communicates in all caps on Twitter, the opposite of quiet. And yet there are places like this and people like Gordon Hempton trying to protect them. And you walk and you walk and you walk, and I saw maybe 4 or 6 people, and you get very wet. And I got there and I sat, and for a little while I was just really irritated. I got there and I'm like, okay, what's going to happen now? Where's my enlightenment? And you learn. You sit and you look around, and this sounds odd to some of us, but you realize that I looked at these trees again, and there is a presence with these ancient trees. There is, and you realize, or I realized, these trees have been around since before Captain Cook landed on Australian soil. They've been around. Some of them have been around before Christopher Columbus arrived in the state. These trees have outlasted all of this stuff that we think is so important. And some of them will survive afterwards, which is the story that you hear now with the Over story, that book. We are starting to realize that some of this stuff is, when it's gone, it'll be gone forever, but other parts of it will outlive us because it just, that's what nature does, right?
So that's a reason, obviously, to preserve those special places. In terms of, though, the restorative or health benefits that we know are pretty well established with meditation, after spending time in nature and walking out of it and coming back to your daily life, do we know whether or not there are kind of benefits that come with that? I mean, it's lovely to be there, but are there residual benefits from it as well?
Well, the Japanese government invested a lot of money in this. There may be a reason for that. It might be that they needed to promote tourism. I'm intrigued that a government, I think they invested about $4 million originally just into research into the benefits of forests, which is where you now have the growing fad or movement towards forest bathing. Because they wanted to know, is walking around in these pine forests that just smell really good. Christmas trees, spas. They smell like spas, which has got to be a good thing. And yeah, again, they found that they signed up enormous, like hundreds of students to do this, and they divided them into people who walk around in the city, people who walk around in city parks, and people who walk around in the forests. And sure enough, they found benefits, ongoing benefits with lowering blood pressure, lowering cortisol. I am now having a brain fade about some of them, but a multitude of benefits that are sustained. In some cases for 3 months. Some of it is not just being in a forest, to be fair. Some of it is to do with the oils that are emitted. So a couple of those trees emit oils that are so good. There's an anti-cancer reaction. And they found that even if they pipe the smells into hotel rooms, you'll get that reaction, which is why I now sleep with it, because it's so good. And since then, you're starting to see research that's taken off in other places. You're seeing it in the UK that, they did an interesting thing with the happiness project. It was called Mappiness, where people would get large numbers again. I think it got up to something like 100,000 people signed up for it, where you would get being on your phone, which is, I don't recommend because that's noise, and you'd have to describe your mood and where you were, take a photo of where you were. Surprise, surprise, people who were in nature or interestingly near the ocean, even in England, which I'm not that fond of the English beach, but overwhelmingly happier. Is that something we'd go, well, yeah, that's obvious, but it's more than just I'm happy because I'm not at work. It's when you start measuring the physical response, more's got to be better than less, is my theory. I compare it again, and I'm rambling a little bit, but being in an office where you have artificial light and artificial air, when did anybody decide that was a good idea to get? Being out of that, writing this book, and we were very committed when we moved back to Brisbane. We were going to find a place that had green trees in our backyard, lots of nature. I went back into an office environment very recently, and within hours, I just felt unwell. And I'm utterly convinced, I haven't done the research on it, that artificial light and artificial air cannot be good for us.
Well, that's a challenge, isn't it? So you can embark on meditation, learn the techniques, gain the benefits, practice, get better at it. You can spend more time in nature, escaping the city, sucking in the air, being by the ocean. It's got to be good. But then there's the avoiding the stuff, avoiding the noise that is so hard to avoid. So as you say, there's the workplace. Modern offices are not great. They're particularly not great if you're a journalist working in an open plan newsroom where there's just noise everywhere. There's that. And then the attendant stuff, which is the digital noise that has become part and parcel also of our job. Social media, carrying the phone around. How have you gone about dealing with that stuff that's hard to keep being a part of that world without engaging in it?
Yeah, and hugely important because firstly, again, I knew that I wasn't going to suddenly go and have a sea change and just live by the sea and think deep thoughts and meditate all day. We have to engage with it, but we have to get a lot smarter about it than I think any of us, none of us signed up for what's actually happening. Why do we have Silicon Valley leaders now saying, I wouldn't give my kids a phone?
Exactly.
Or sending them to schools that are completely digitally free. And I'm talking people like, Bill Gates and Melinda Gates have since acknowledged, wouldn't give the kids a phone, you know, to even as teenagers. I don't think that was a great idea. Host of people who've left Facebook and said we are destroying the social fabric. God knows what we're doing to our kids. That's a former Facebook founder said that. Why do they know that?
Our brains are changing because of these
The
devices.
neuroscience about that I found really both terrifying but also compelling.
Yeah.
And really, if you step back and think again, it is a fraction of human history from an evolutionary perspective that we've had these devices that have made us constantly attentive and alert. It's a fraction of time. Our brains haven't evolved to deal with that. As a result, we're seeing, you know, peaking anxiety, peaking depression, you know, lots of bad self-esteem stuff for kids. We're seeing, you know, growing rates of insomnia. Why? Well, you only have to listen to these Silicon Valley guys who created this stuff. A fellow called Tristan Harris, who left Google, is sort of leading the charge on a lot of this stuff. And he describes these digital devices in terms of what they're doing to our brains as, he calls them the slot machine in your pocket, the poker machine in your pocket. Why? Because what they are doing is lighting up the dopamine loops in your brain that are the same loops that light up when you're in front of a poker machine. Why do they do that? And this is the scary thing, because what Silicon Valley does is go to places like Stanford, the Behavioral Change Lab, which was set up by a fellow called, it will come to be BJ Fagg, to use computers, to use technology to change behavior. Well, you know, okay, we do that all the time, but you're getting the brightest, the best and brightest, you know, in the US, picked off from this nursery and told, right, use this technology to change human behavior to a degree that's now even the leaders, many of the leaders are saying, actually, we opened a Pandora's box now and we don't know how to put the thing back in.
Yeah.
Many of them have left. And I think that is, when you're talking about Facebook having, you know, being a country, the biggest country in the world, bigger than China, 2 billion people, 2 billion, more than 2 billion now. People are hooked into Facebook. We don't know how they do what they're doing. We have very little transparency. We know that. We're seeing that now with you know, the elections. We've seen it. And their own people are saying, yeah, this stuff is addictive. We actually deliberately made it addictive.
Yeah.
The fellow who invented the Facebook, the thumbs up, who actually said, you know, he saw this just tectonic shift when suddenly people could like stuff. Why? Because that gives you a little spark of dopamine. And they tell you that they do the opposite. They withhold things because it spikes your cortisol.
I know, it's scary, isn't it?
You know, to think, and you don't like hearing that your kids are exposed to that, but then you look at yourself and you realize, well, what am I doing? What am I doing on my newsfeed? Why is that any better or worse than what the kids are doing on, you know, TikTok or Candy Crush or any others?
So in a way, it's up to us to, and it's easier when you're an adult, obviously, than when you're younger, to disentangle ourselves from that. But some of these things are easier to disentangle from than others. Okay, you can cancel your social media accounts, you can discipline yourself to maybe only check Facebook briefly at night, whatever. But something like email, for example, which has just worked its way into essential work practice now. You quote a statistic, the average full-time American worker spends 2.6 hours a day attending to responding to email. That's the extent to which it's kind of worked its way in. How do you even start to ignore or get away from that noise that's in all of our lives?
And I want to really, I mean, it's very hard to pursue any sort of effort towards silence without becoming a little radicalized about the advanced capitalist society that we live in now, that rates us, that just keeps saying, be productive, be more productive, be more productive. And there's a bunch of people saying, but I don't know what that how are you measuring that? Because, and I'm quite serious about that, because productivity, in the book, I argue that, you know, in lieu of any measure that can really say what you, Paul Barclay, are doing, actually, you're probably quite easy to measure because you've got certain shows that you have to put out. But what you have is this faux busyness. You have to appear busy. It's this kabuki, corporate kabuki that we do where look at us having all of these meetings, because meetings is the other one. I say that, you know, the noise in the noise of the office is email overload, the culture of meetings, just being there talking, but not actually deciding on doing anything. And the open plan office, because again, you can be seen to be being busy.
Performative busyness.
Performative busyness, yes. Yeah. Because, and that is, what I want to challenge about that is, where is the measure that says that that is boosting creativity or strategic thinking? Why do people like Bill Gates go off into a forest and nobody can contact him for a certain period of time? It shouldn't just be a luxury for people like that, because we know, instinctively we know, you're not creative on cue, and you're not, I would challenge the idea, and I've seen prime ministers, I've written about prime ministers, and I've seen CEOs who, once they're in that cycle of social media noise, particularly responding to news noise, they're not doing strategic thinking. You can't. It's actually impossible to do. I think Stanford has shown, they've discounted the idea that your brain can multitask. We know that now.
Yeah, that research was interesting, yeah.
Really interesting, because it's actually, I encourage people to think of it now as, you're not multitasking, you're actually just keeping multiple tabs open like you do with your internet browser. And we know it drains the battery.
You're doing a bunch of things suboptimally, basically, aren't you?
Yeah. What I've done, to go back to your question about, there's all this, you can feel overwhelmed. And what I deliberately did with the book in the end is say, okay, can't change everything at once. What can we do? And I speak about, at the end, what I call slivers of silence, slices of silence, and big fat slabs of silence. They're the ones that, you know, a 10-day retreat, if you ever feel like it, I'm not going to say that you have to do that, but the things that they're the things that, yeah, okay, yeah, maybe I aim for that. But in the meantime, what can I do during the day, maybe once a day or once a week? And they're the slivers. Slivers and slabs. Slivers are like something I encourage people to do now, which is just when you park your car, if you have to commute to work, I now turn everything off and just sit for a minute. Not meditating necessarily, just observing where I am. There's the sky, there's a tree, there's whatever. Not immediately going into the to-do list of what I've got to do for the day. So that's the sort of thing that can actually just give your brain the break, which again, there is research that says that we need to do a hard stop. I am now stopping the commute and getting the kids to school, and now starting this new task of going to work. But
you're a high achieving, you impose demands on yourself. You like to, I'm sure, be excellent at everything that you do. How have you found moving from this world of busyness and craziness to slowing down, meditating, being mindful? How do you feel you've gone in achieving that? And do you admonish yourself from time to time that perhaps you're not mindful enough, that you're not slowing down enough? Give us an idea of how you think you've gone now.
It's very humbling. I know when I need to meditate. Peter Grester, I know you're laughing. He experiences the non-meditating Christine Jackman regularly. I know I'm a political junkie. I studied politics. I covered a presidential election. I covered an impeachment. I love politics. However, so I get that, Paul.
Yeah.
And if during an election campaign or things like that, I have Twitter back on, I know. Yeah. I think one of the things is, once you have started doing things like meditation or just training yourself to watch, observe, be present, you will then become more aware of when you're not doing that. So I know now, oh, that's what I'm doing. At the beginning of the COVID stuff, the beginning of the pandemic, I did what a lot of people did. Went on social media and watched it. Like suddenly, like if I watch this really closely, I'm going to see something really amazing. Whereas, I knew you'd be doing it. Yeah. Whereas what you're actually going to see is a multitude of politicians talking about stuff, and lots of stuff that none of it's going to fix this pandemic. We know the pandemic is going to be fixed by science.
No, it's a stupid thing to do.
Yeah. I feel, I'll be honest, yes, I still have the identity crisis of wanting to be a slow, well-researched journalist. I have to pull myself up, and this is a rallying cry for us. I still have to pull myself up and go, yeah, but where is that happening? Do not get pulled back into just more words in a waterfall of words for the sake of creating more noise. If you're going to write something, go away and think about it and make it quality words. Is that challenging? It's more than challenging. It's actually a luxury. It's a white privilege. A lot of people don't have the privilege to say, I'm just going to write better, slower, more quality.
Yeah, but you feel like you're living a better life now, a quieter life. You're finding more silence. You're feeling that you're dealing with your insomnia. Those sorts of things feel better than they did at the beginning of this quest.
Yeah, they do. I know. You do not achieve enlightenment. I think some people might, I assume, in lifetimes. But it's a humbling process.
Yeah.
You know when you've fallen off the wagon and you've got to get back on it. But I know, for example, that simply going and walking in the nature reserve that our house is on with the dog and no headphones, which is something I never would have done back in my busy, I'm very important days. I know I feel better now. I know I feel better hugging a particular tree. I don't hug it, I pat it. I just know that makes me hopefully a better partner, a better mother, and probably a better writer, journalist, and commentator, if that's what I needed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, it's been great talking to you. It's fantastic chat. As always, the hour has gone like that. We're going to have to wrap it up, and I think I'm going to hand over to Chrissy, who's going to wrap up the Zoom session. Thanks to the Zoom audience, by the way. It's we can't see you, or we kind of can see you, but it's great to know that you've been there.
In fact, Emma, Kate and I just worked out, thank you very much, Paul, that we can actually ask a question. She's texting it to me. Well, we can ask more, but unfortunately with this much time, I think that Zoom gets a bit kind of funny after about an hour. So it kind of wants to shut down on me.
Be a big important
so
question.
This question is from Claire, watching on the Zoom audience, who says, hi, I'd love to ask if you've worked in so many high pressure environments and with so many demanding people, do you have any tips for using silence or noise to deal with interesting people / bosses, perhaps? That is a question I think everyone might want you to tell them about.
Sorry. A few spring to mind, strangely enough. I do actually, because I observed it in one workplace where there was, and it's written, I write about it in the book, that there was a deep discomfort with the fact that a colleague of mine who gave very, very good advice would take a mere 5 to 7 seconds, I timed it after a while because people were so disconcerted by it, to give responses. Now, I have to say this person gave such good advice in response to policy questions, political challenges, that I actually thought, he's going to put me out of a job. This is really awkward. Do I support him, or do I go, yeah, he's really weird, because he takes that really weird 5-second pause thing. And it made me realize that if you're in a situation like that, the one thing you can do is go, that's a really important question. I'd like to think about it. It's a really, really important question. And I'm going to think about it and come back to you in an hour. Now, if somebody's uncomfortable with that, you do have to be brave enough to say, to take it to the next level, which is, how many issues in the world need split-second responses? They're normally life-threatening things. If you're saving somebody's life, or landing planes, maybe. But in most cases, those sorts of questions, when you're giving advice, they actually deserve, the way to express it is that you actually deserve a quality answer. I want to give you a deep, well thought out quality answer, and I'm going to take a bit of time.
Fantastic. That's great. Is there anybody in the real life audience who has a question for Christine at this point? Questions? No? Yes.
Question. Thanks, Christine. That was lovely. I'm just interested, and you may have come across this in your research. That's what I want to ask about, is that, we know that people who've suffered from extreme trauma will sometimes go into dissociative states. And as medical professionals, we consider this as something negative, that you know, it's a flag that they're unwell, it needs to be dealt with, it needs to be treated. And I'm just wondering if you've ever come across any evidence that maybe it's protective. Maybe it's part of this, you know, they've experienced extreme noise and that there's, you know, there's a kind of protective dampening down, trying to shut things out so they can recover.
Not necessarily in this book, but yes, in research, I have formed the view, and certainly spoken to people who've worked with PTSD survivors, both in from war zones and also trauma, domestic type trauma, that this is going to sound quite challenging for some, but what dissociating is actually a very, I would say, a healthy response, and go with me, to a very unhealthy situation. What the brain is doing is saying all of your emotions and normal ways of dealing with the world are actually endangering you. You know, if you're in a violent situation, you want to get the hell out because you're on the front line, or with a very violent partner, often emotion and doing, you know, and just losing it because your life is in danger is actually the worst thing to do. Shutting all that stuff down is the brain going, I'm going to take over now. You don't actually know, this is an animal instinct and we're going to take it down to that notch. And the unhealthy part, or the part where it becomes problematic, is to get people back out of that, as I'm sure from the sounds of it, you would have experienced. I would say a lot of what I experienced and what other people who say, this just feels, I feel overstimulated, I feel anxious, I feel overwhelmed. And that's what, by the way, I was saying to my GP. Why do I feel sick? Can you take more blood tests? I feel awful. What I realized, I started to think is, am I just having a healthy response to a really unhealthy, you know, lifestyle of working flat out all the time with no respite? You know, is this actually a really healthy response? And that's where I say that quietening down can be radicalizing, because you actually start looking around going, maybe I'm not the crazy one. Maybe the world has gotten a bit crazy.
Thanks for that. Look, I know that you guys on Zoom have been there for a very long time, and it's quite tiring. So I think we'll finish up there. And I'd love everyone in the room and quietly on Zoom, if we want to have a clap for Paul Barclay and Christine Jackman. And do remember to purchase that book. You can use the code EVENT online, and you can get a 10% off all your books in your cart. So everyone, let's thank Paul Barclay, Christine Jackman.
Rosemary.